In the final months of 1941, as the United States edged closer to war, a quiet unease settled over the Navy's Atlantic Fleet. The oceans had become unpredictable battlefields, yet not every loss could be traced to U-boats or storms. One of the most unsettling cases emerged from the disappearance of the USS Proteus, a massive collier with a seasoned crew, lost without a trace just weeks before Pearl Harbor. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic but ordinary wartime mishap. But the ship's final hours and the silence that followed remain one of the Navy's most puzzling mysteries. The Proteus had departed St. Thomas on November 14, 1941, bound for Newfoundland. Her cargo was straightforward: bauxite ore vital for aluminum production. She carried 58 men, many of whom had served aboard her for years. They knew her quirks, her groans, and the way she handled in rough seas. Yet even these experienced sailors could not have predicted the string of events that would unfold. The Atlantic trade routes had become increasingly dangerous, with German U-boats pushing farther west. Convoy escorts were spread thin, and the Proteus traveled alone, relying on radio silence and caution to reduce detection. Still, by all accounts, conditions were stable. Weather logs from nearby ships recorded moderate seas and no tropical disturbances. A surviving entry in a merchant vessel's logbook, written the same day the Proteus vanished, mentions clear horizon, mild swell, visibility excellent. It was exactly the kind of day in which a ship of the Proteus's size should have moved confidently across the Atlantic. Yet sometime between November 14th and November 23rd, she simply disappeared. No distress call. No debris. Not even an oil slick. To unravel the mystery, naval investigators retraced the ship's maintenance history. The collier belonged to the same class as the USS Cyclops, which had vanished under similarly murky circumstances in 1918. Both ships had been built for heavy or transport, both were designed with massive cargo holds, and both were known to experience structural strain when fully loaded. A memo from the Bureau of Ships dated October 1941 hinted at these concerns, noting increasing evidence that the keel structure of colliers of this class may fatigue under extended strain. Yet the document concluded there was no imminent danger to operations. Crew diaries recovered from earlier voyages only deepened the uncertainty. One entry from boatswain's mate second class Arthur Melvin, written 2 months before the disappearance, reads, "Ship feels heavy this run. More groans from the starboard bow. Chief says it's nothing but men don't like the sound." There was no follow-up and no indication that the complaints ever escalated to formal reports. But to a historian, such entries raise the uncomfortable possibility that the Proteus carried hidden vulnerabilities. As investigators worked through the timeline, a strange contradiction emerged. The German Navy, famous for meticulous record-keeping, had no U-boat claims in the area where the Proteus was believed to have sailed. Post-war analyses of Kriegsmarine logs revealed not a single submarine reporting action against a ship matching the collier's profile. Naval historian Dr. Henry Wakeman later commented, "If a U-boat had taken her, the claim would almost certainly have been filed." Germany needed the propaganda value in 1941. Without an enemy explanation, the Navy faced a more troubling scenario. The ship may have suffered a catastrophic internal failure. Some theorists pointed to the highly concentrated bauxite ore in her holds. If the cargo shifted suddenly, the ship could have capsized in minutes, leaving no opportunity for a distress call. Others questioned whether metal fatigue along the keel caused a sudden structural collapse. A former fleet engineer, interviewed decades later, said, "If her spine gave way, she would have folded like a matchstick." The absence of floating wreckage, however, challenged even these grim possibilities. Typically, even fast sinkings leave behind some evidence. Modern analysts reflect on the case as a lesson in the unpredictable nature of wartime logistics. Ships that were never intended for such heavy and continuous use often operated on the limits of their endurance. And in the rush toward mobilization, small warning signs could be overlooked or dismissed. Naval archives from 1941 reveal a fleet stretched thin, with commanders tasked to keep supply lines moving at all costs. The Proteus may have been one of several ships pushed past its design threshold. But the unanswered questions are what give the mystery its staying power. Why no radio call? Why no debris field? Why no eyewitness reports from nearby vessels? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why did the Proteus vanish under circumstances so eerily similar to the Cyclops, despite decades of improved protocols? As the Navy filed its final report, the conclusion felt less like a solution and more like resignation. Cause of loss unknown, it read. Presumed foundered. With the United States now fully engaged in the war after Pearl Harbor, the disappearance faded into the background. Yet for the families of the 58 men lost and for naval historians who still revisit the case, the mystery endures, an early wartime omen that not all dangers in the Atlantic would come from the enemy. The stage was set for more unexplained sinkings to follow, some with survivors' accounts, others with conflicting reports, and many with evidence that raised more questions than answers. And soon, another ship would meet a similarly enigmatic fate. At dawn on July 2, 1940, the waters west of Ireland were calm, an uneasy calm that often preceded tragedy during the Battle of the Atlantic. The British liner SS Arandora Star, painted dull gray for wartime service, was steaming northwest from Liverpool, carrying over 1,500 internees and POWs to Canada. Though she was not an armed merchant cruiser, her mission was considered sensitive, even controversial. What happened next would become one of the most contested maritime losses of the early war, a sinking surrounded by confusion, conflicting testimony, and unresolved questions that linger within naval circles to this day. To understand the weight of the disaster, one must first recognize the Arandora Star's precarious situation. Designed as a cruise vessel, she lacked the defensive compartmentalization found in military transports. Her passenger lists, Italians, Germans, and a handful of civilian deportees, were not combatants, yet they became casualties of naval strategy. The Admiralty had been under pressure to move internees overseas after Italy's entry into the war in June 1940. But the preparations were rushed. Lifeboat drills were insufficient, and the ship lacked an escort through waters increasingly patrolled by German U-boats. In the early hours of July 2, the threat materialized. Kapitän-Leutnant Gunther Preen, commander of U-47 and already notorious for his daring raid on Scapa Flow, had intercepted the Arandora Star roughly 75 miles off the coast of Ireland. According to the Kriegsmarine War Diary entry for that day, Preen identified the ship as a large transport, and at 6:15 fired a single G7E torpedo. The blast hit near the engine room, cutting power instantly. This much the historical record supports. But what followed, the pattern of secondary explosions, survivor testimony, and the ship's rapid sinking, has fueled decades of speculation. Survivors later told inquiry boards that the first explosion was followed by a second, sharper detonation minutes later. One crewman described it as a punch from beneath, stronger than a single torpedo should have produced. Others insist the first blast alone caused the fatal damage. The Admiralty initially dismissed these accounts, attributing the additional noise to collapsing bulkheads or steam lines rupturing under pressure. Yet internal memos reveal a different tone. One classified note, written by Captain Harold Graham of Naval Intelligence, reads, "Multiple shock signatures reported, recommend examination of cargo stowage and structural vulnerability." The ship's cargo has since become central to the mystery. The Arandora Star carried minimal military supplies, primarily luggage, stores, and a small allotment of administrative equipment. Nothing explosive. Nothing that should have triggered a second detonation. Modern naval historians have posed an uncomfortable possibility, that the second blast was not an explosion at all, but the rapid implosion of compartments as seawater crushed weakened hull sections. A ship built for luxury cruises, repainted and repurposed in haste, may simply not have been structurally suited for a torpedo strike at the waterline. Yet other discrepancies persisted. Some survivors testified that the U-boat surfaced nearby after the attack, a detail absent in Preen's war diary. Others described hearing what sounded like two torpedoes entering the water, though U-boat doctrine at the time emphasized single-shot attacks against transports. Conflicting accounts from different parts of the vessel made reconstruction nearly impossible. In chaotic evacuations, memory often distorts. But the Admiralty took these inconsistencies seriously enough to file several inquiry notes under restricted classification, many of which remained sealed until the 1970s. The struggle aboard the sinking liner was harrowing. With power lost, communication lines down, and many internees locked behind barriers designed for immigration security, evacuation became a desperate fight for survival. Lifeboats jammed in their davits. Others capsized under the weight of terrified men. One diary entry from a British guard, Private John McEwen, later recovered among personal effects, captured the grim reality. "We shouted for order, but language failed us. The ship was listing, groaning. Men were crying for home." Despite these challenges, nearly 900 men did manage to abandon ship before she rolled and slipped beneath the waves roughly an hour after the torpedo impact. In the aftermath, the Arandora Star's loss was both a human tragedy and an intelligence puzzle. Why was she sent without escort? Why was her presence in that patrol zone not better concealed? And why did Admiralty documents refer repeatedly to anomalous blast patterns after publicly declaring the incident straightforward? Some historians suggest political sensitivities discouraged deeper investigation. Britain's policy of mass internment and deportation was already controversial, and any suggestion of preventable error risked public backlash. For modern naval analysts, the case underscores the importance of escort policy, hull engineering, and intelligence coordination. The tragedy pushed the British government to revise internment protocols and reconsider transport sailing orders. Yet among researchers, the lingering question remains: were the conflicting explosion reports the product of panic and disorientation, or did they point to a structural failure that was later quietly buried in bureaucracy? As the war intensified, the Arandora Star's fate became only one of many maritime losses clouded by contradiction. But it set a precedent, a reminder that even well-documented sinkings could contain shadows of uncertainty. And soon, another wartime vessel would meet a similarly troubling and disputed end, one with even fewer survivors to clarify the truth. In the early morning hours of November 13, 1942, the waters off Guadalcanal churned with the chaos of one of the fiercest surface engagements of the Pacific War. Amid the thunder of naval gunfire and the glow of burning ships, one vessel fought desperately to survive: the light cruiser USS Juno. The ship, manned by 697 sailors including the 5 Sullivan brothers, had already endured brutal combat. Yet what would follow after the initial battle was not just another wartime tragedy, but one of the most debated sinkings in U.S. naval history, marked by inconsistencies, structural mysteries, and unanswered questions that have lingered for decades. The Juno had been part of Task Force 67, supporting operations around Guadalcanal as U.S. forces attempted to hold Henderson Field. That night, American and Japanese ships collided in a violent, close-range duel that left both sides shattered. In the chaos, Juno was struck by a torpedo from the Japanese destroyer Amatsuke's, blowing a 40-foot hole into her port side. The explosion crippled her forward firepower and forced her to withdraw. According to reports from the cruiser USS Helena, the damage was severe but not immediately fatal. The ship still made 13 knots, limping southward alongside the battered remnants of the task force. But beneath the battered exterior lay deeper concerns. Survivors later recounted how the Juno's hull vibrated unnaturally after the torpedo hit, groaning with each shift of the waves. Radioman 3rd Class Warren Bessel described it as a sound like metal bending past its limit. Naval engineers have since argued that the Atlanta-class cruisers, while fast and heavily armed, possessed design vulnerabilities: minimal armor, cramped machinery spaces, and a single fragile longitudinal bulkhead that was prone to catastrophic failure under torpedo impact. Wartime records from the Bureau of Ships noted similar concerns in sister ships, though these assessments rarely reached commanding officers in the field. As dawn broke, the wounded cruiser tried to rejoin the escort formation, maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. But at 11:01 a.m., the lurking Japanese submarine I-26 seized its opportunity. Commander Yokota Minoru fired a spread of torpedoes toward the formation, intending to target the undamaged cruiser Helena. One torpedo, however, veered toward the Juno. What happened next remains one of the most violent second-act explosions recorded in the Pacific theater. The torpedo struck almost directly amidships, near the spot where the earlier hit had weakened internal supports. The ship seemed to disintegrate in seconds. Official Navy reports state that the Juno exploded in a blinding flash, breaking apart so rapidly that few men topside had time to react. But post-war analyses raised questions. Why did the ship appear to detonate with such extraordinary force from a single torpedo? Why did eyewitness accounts from nearby ships differ so drastically in describing the blast pattern? And could structural stress from the first hit have primed the cruiser for instantaneous breakup? The most compelling clues emerged from survivor testimony, limited though it was. Only 10 men remained alive after the blast and the days that followed. One survivor, Seaman Albert Shands, recalled seeing the ship lift out of the water before splitting. Another described hearing a crack, like a gunshot, consistent with a catastrophic keel failure rather than purely explosive force. The Atlanta-class design placed ammunition magazines near key structural supports, which may have detonated sympathetically once the hull gave way. Yet even this theory leaves unanswered questions. The Juno's crew had been fighting fires all night, and the magazines were believed to be partially depleted. Could residual charges alone account for the scale of destruction? The human story only deepens the tragedy. Due to the urgent condition of nearby ships and the mistaken belief that no one survived the explosion, the task force did not remain to search for survivors. Orders from Admiral Willis Lee, transmitted under combat urgency, reflected the brutal logic of the Pacific War. Cannot risk remaining in submarine waters. For the men left behind, this decision sealed days of suffering. For historians, it added another layer of unease. How many more first-hand accounts might have clarified the ship's final moments had rescue been possible? Modern naval architects studying the sinking point to lessons about structural fatigue, redundancy, and the dangers of clustered vital systems. The Juno's catastrophic breakup helped shape later cruiser designs, emphasizing armor distribution and reinforced longitudinal framing. Yet these technical explanations fail to fully resolve the conflicting eyewitness accounts recorded that day, accounts that suggest something unusual occurred deep within the ship as it took its final torpedo. The unanswered questions have turned the Juno's loss into more than a wartime tragedy. It stands as a structural mystery, an engineering cautionary tale, and a poignant narrative of sacrifice etched into American naval memory. And as the war pressed on, more such incidents would follow, ships lost under strange circumstances, reports that didn't align, and wartime secrecy that kept the truth submerged for decades. Ahead lay another sinking, this time in the frozen waters of the Arctic Circle, where a single unexpected blast would ripple through Allied intelligence and raise suspicions that persist to this day. In the frigid spring of 1945, as the Second World War neared its end, the icy waters of the Barents Sea were still among the deadliest in the world. Allied convoys carrying weapons, fuel, and vehicles to the Soviet Union continued to face ferocious opposition, not only from German aircraft and U-boats, but from the unforgiving Arctic environment itself. It was within this lethal corridor that the River-class frigate HMS Goodall, part of the hard-fighting 3rd Escort Group, met a fate so sudden, violent, and perplexing that it remains one of the least understood naval losses of the Northern Front. The Goodall had been assigned to escort convoy RA-66, a homebound formation returning from the port of Murmansk. By late April 1945, morale among the escort ships was high. Germany was collapsing on all fronts, and U-boat activity, while still dangerous, had become increasingly desperate. But the Barents Sea had a cruel way of punishing overconfidence. On April 29, the convoy approached the approaches to the Kola Inlet, a familiar but treacherous stretch of water monitored heavily by German submarine units operating from bases in northern Norway. That evening, the silent hunter that shadowed RA-66 was U-286, a Type VIC submarine under the command of Captain Lieutenant Willy Dietrich. According to reconstructed U-boat war diaries, the submarine maneuvered into firing position as the convoy prepared to enter the protected harbor area. The first hint of danger came at 2000 hours when HMS Anguilla, sweeping the perimeter, detected a fleeting sonar contact. The signal vanished before depth charges could be set. Moments later, a devastating explosion shattered the calm. HMS Goodall, stationed near the rear of the escort screen, was struck by what officially was recorded as a G7ET5 acoustic torpedo. But the force of the blast stunned even veteran sailors. Captain Bill Woodward of the sister ship HMS Lockanish later wrote, "I have seen ships struck before, but this was different. It was as though something tore her open from within." The explosion instantly ignited ammunition in the forward magazine. The bow of the frigate, nearly the entire front third, was obliterated in a single catastrophic moment. Men on deck were thrown against the railings, others vanished without a trace. Survivor accounts complicate the official narrative. Several crew members reported seeing only a single plume, not the dual detonation one might expect from a torpedo strike followed by a magazine explosion. One signalman even claimed the blast appeared to originate slightly aft of the bow, near the forward ammunition hold, raising questions about whether the torpedo actually struck where the Navy assumed. Naval engineers who studied the wreckage after the war found signs consistent with internal detonation, suggesting the possibility that unstable depth charges or ammunition may have cooked off due to shock. Yet others disagreed. Commander Gerald Hayes, an anti-submarine warfare specialist, argued that the G7E torpedo of that late war period had undergone modifications by the Germans, including an improved magnetic influence detonator. If such a detonator triggered beneath the keel rather than against the hull, the resulting pressure wave could have mimicked an internal explosion. However, German records recovered after the war contain no mention of such modifications on U-286, nor do they confirm a successful hit at the precise time the Goodall was destroyed. The U-boat's war diary, fragmentary and partially lost, never claimed the sinking. Compounding the mystery is the fact that RA-66 was operating in extremely shallow coastal waters at the time, well within the range where depth charge patterns could pose a lethal risk to the escort ships themselves. One theory suggests that a depth charge accidentally detonated aboard Goodall just as the U-boat torpedo struck or passed beneath the hull, amplifying the blast. This would explain the magnitude of the explosion and the near-instantaneous destruction of the bow. But such a coincidence, while physically possible, would have been extraordinarily rare. There were also intelligence implications. Allied decrypts of German signals from earlier that week hinted that U-boats in the area carried a limited supply of T-11 torpedoes, an experimental pattern-running weapon not yet widely deployed. No official record confirms that U-286 had such ordnance, but the mere suggestion troubled Admiralty analysts. A report marked Most Secret, authored by the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division in June 1945, asked bluntly, was HMS Goodall the target of an unreported weapon test? The question was never publicly addressed. In the aftermath, rescue efforts were immediate but hampered by darkness, drifting ice, and lingering fear of additional submarine attacks. Of the Goodall's crew of over 120 men, more than half were killed instantly. Survivors were pulled from the water by HMS Loch Innes and HMS Anguilla, many suffering from severe burns and exposure. The shock of the sinking reverberated through the convoy, and for the remainder of the voyage, escorts maintained heightened vigilance, sweeping constantly for a U-boat that would never be conclusively identified. Modern naval historians view the tragedy through the lens of late-war desperation, German submarines using every weapon at their disposal, and Allied escorts stretched thin across countless convoys. Yet the deeper mystery remains unresolved. Was HMS Goodall the victim of a conventional torpedo strike amplified by tragic coincidence? A premature detonation of her own ordnance? Or something else entirely, an undocumented last-ditch German innovation that vanished with the fall of the Third Reich? As the wreck settled into the icy seabed, so too did the questions surrounding her fate. But the war still had another maritime enigma to reveal, this time involving a ship halfway across the world, carrying cargo so sensitive that parts of its story would remain sealed for decades. By mid-1944, the Arabian Sea had become a crossroads of global wartime logistics, an expanse of water often overshadowed by the battles in Europe and the Pacific, yet just as vital to the Allied war effort. It was here, far from the typical U-boat hunting grounds, that the Liberty ship SS John Barry embarked on a voyage that would become one of the most enigmatic maritime losses of the entire conflict. Her sinking was officially attributed to a German submarine operating at extreme range. But the secrecy surrounding her cargo, the swiftness of her destruction, and the hurried salvage attempts that followed created a mystery that would not fully resurface until decades after the war. Commissioned in 1941 and operated by the War Shipping Administration, the John Barry was a workhorse, a standard Liberty ship assigned to carry supplies from the United States to Allied forces across the Indian Ocean. On the night of August 28, 1944, she steamed northward through the Arabian Sea en route to Bandar Abbas in Iran. Her manifest listed general cargo: mail, spare parts, vehicle components, and food supplies. But some documents hinted at something else, sealed crates marked only with U.S. Treasury identifiers. Their purpose was so classified that even senior officers aboard the ship were not aware of their contents. At around 10:45 p.m., while the John Barry sailed roughly 185 nautical miles southeast of the Arabian Peninsula, an unexpected threat rose from the depths. German submarine U-859, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Johann Jebsen, had been dispatched on a long-range mission to the Indian Ocean, a bold attempt to disrupt Allied shipping lanes rarely patrolled by Axis forces. In a report later recovered by British intelligence, U-859 noted tracking a fast-moving freighter, unescorted, in a region where merchant captains typically believed themselves safe. The submarine fired 2 torpedoes. Survivor accounts reveal the chilling sequence. The first torpedo struck just aft of the bridge, igniting an immediate burst of flame. The second, hitting closer to the stern, caused a deeper, more violent shock that wrenched the hull and sent machinery flying. Captain Joseph D. Jones ordered the crew to abandon ship, but many men were forced to jump directly into the oil-coated water as flames swept across the deck. The ship sank stern first within minutes. Yet what puzzled the Navy was the nature of the explosions. Reports from survivors mention a third blast, one not accounted for by the torpedo strikes. Some described it as muffled, internal, and metallic, occurring as the ship began its final descent. A few suggested the detonation came from within the sealed treasury crates. The Navy rejected the claim. But behind closed doors, intelligence officers took it seriously. Post-war revelations added new layers to the mystery. Declassified documents revealed the John Barry had carried an enormous reserve of U.S. silver bullion, over 3,000 tons, destined for a wartime payment agreement involving the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the Middle East Supply Center. The bullion, minted into coins, was intended to stabilize currency systems in newly liberated or strategically significant regions. Why the mission required such secrecy remains unclear, but the Treasury Department treated the shipment with unusual discretion. In the hours following the sinking, the nearest escort vessel, the British sloop HMS Shoreham, launched rescue operations, pulling dozens of survivors from the water. Captain Jones later described the loss as sudden, violent, and without warning, noting how quickly the ship succumbed. Yet even in the aftermath there was tension. A U.S. Navy official dispatched to interview survivors insisted that no mention of unusual cargo be included in the final report. The ship's classified manifest was quietly transferred to the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. For decades, the SS John Barry remained a ghost of wartime secrecy, until the 1980s, when an international salvage expedition discovered her wreck lying upright on the seabed, nearly intact. The divers found the hull remarkably preserved, contradicting earlier assumptions that she had broken apart. More surprising were the silver coins recovered from the forward hold, tangible evidence of the Treasury cargo the Navy had never officially acknowledged during the war. But even with these discoveries, questions linger. Why did the ship sink so rapidly for a Liberty vessel, which typically remained buoyant for longer even when torpedoed? What caused the unexplained internal detonation described by the crew? And why were salvage operations, normally routine for wartime losses with valuable cargo, postponed for nearly 40 years? Modern analysts offer several interpretations. Some suggest that one of the Treasury crates contained volatile materials not properly recorded. Others argue that the ship's structural integrity had been compromised by overloading, a known but underreported issue with Liberty ships under wartime pressures. Another theory holds that the combination of two nearly simultaneous torpedo hits triggered a cascading failure in her cargo decks. Yet the classified silence surrounding her mission remains the most enduring thread. The John Barry's loss sits at the intersection of war, secrecy, and geopolitical maneuvering, an example of how the fog of war extends far beyond the battlefield. As the Liberty ship settled into the depths of the Arabian Sea, so too did the truth of her mission. And even as the war neared its closing stages, the Allies were about to confront yet another naval mystery, one involving missing records, conflicting survivor accounts, and an official conclusion that still leaves historians uneasy today. By the end of 1945, the oceans were finally quiet. Battleships no longer clashed in the night. Convoys no longer zigzagged at flank speed to dodge torpedoes. The war was over, but the records it left behind told a more complicated story. As Allied intelligence teams compiled after-action reports, captured enemy logs and eyewitness statements, they found that not all naval losses fit neatly into the official wartime narrative. Some ships had sunk too quickly. Others had vanished with suspiciously little trace. And still others were recorded with conflicting accounts that no inquiry could fully reconcile. These unresolved cases formed the backbone of an internal dossier that naval historians later dubbed the Unsolved Five. The compilation began in October 1945, when the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence and the British Admiralty launched joint efforts to finalize war loss registers. Both agencies hoped to close the books on wartime sinkings by cross-referencing Allied logs with captured German and Japanese records. The goal was clarity. Instead, they uncovered contradictions, discrepancies in timing, weapon signatures, and even the location of sinkings. Some commanders had died before submitting full reports. Others had written hastily in moments of crisis. A few ships, like the USS Proteus and the SS John Barry, had losses so poorly documented that even seasoned analysts struggled to create a coherent timeline. The tension deepened as intelligence officers pulled naval memos from wartime filing systems. Many sinkings, it turned out, had been analyzed under intense pressure. When sonar teams detected a rogue contact or observers reported enemy presence, assumptions could crystallize into fact before evidence was fully verified. In several cases, especially early in the war, German U-boats were credited with attacks they had never claimed. Conversely, some U-boats claimed sinkings that no Allied records could confirm. This muddled picture forced analysts to question long-held conclusions. The Admiralty's internal review documents reveal quiet acknowledgement of this uncertainty. One note from Commander Peter Littleton, dated December 1945, reads, "In some engagements, the conditions of battle precluded accurate observation. We must accept margins of error." Another, written by an ONI operations analyst, is more direct. Several Atlantic losses remain unverified by either enemy records or physical evidence. These must be listed as unexplained unless new material surfaces. These statements were never meant for public release. For families awaiting closure, officials presented definitive answers whenever possible. But within intelligence circles there was growing discomfort. Historians reviewing the files decades later discovered that at least 5 ships, including the Proteus, Arendora Star, Juno, Goodall, and John Barry, had been flagged as cases where official findings do not fully match eyewitness or engineering analysis. None hinted at conspiracy. Instead, they reflected the chaos and fog of war, rushed decisions, incomplete reports, and the simple reality that the oceans do not easily surrender their secrets. One striking example involved discrepancies in blast signatures. For ships like Juno and Goodall, modern engineers examining survivor testimony found patterns consistent with structural failure rather than purely enemy action. In other cases, such as the disappearance of the Proteus, the complete absence of a debris field raised questions about whether earlier, unreported structural fatigue had played a role. Admiralty analysts in 1946 tried to account for these anomalies but lacked the underwater forensic methods available today. Yet even with modern technology, not every explanation fits neatly. The discovery of the SS John Barry's intact wreck contradicted earlier assumptions that she had broken apart. Likewise, the absence of U-boat claims for certain sinkings left historians wondering whether some losses had been misattributed to the enemy when they were in fact the result of mechanical failure, cargo instability, or catastrophic design vulnerabilities. Naval experts today caution against viewing wartime reports as final verdicts. Many were written in shock, darkness, or under fire. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the post-war inquiries is what they suggest about the psychology of naval warfare. In moments of crisis, crews often had only seconds to observe an attack, form an impression, and react. Their accounts, sincere, urgent, and often contradictory, reflected the limits of human perception in extreme circumstances. Officials reviewing these testimonies struggled to weave them into a single narrative. In the end, they recorded the simplest conclusion: cause uncertain. As the war's final files were boxed and archived, a sense of unfinished business lingered. Naval intelligence officers had achieved their primary mission, compiling the official list of losses and documenting the known causes. But their private notes told a different story, that the sea, even in an age of advancing technology, still held too many variables, too many shadows, and too many moments when ships slipped below the surface before anyone understood what had happened. Today, the lingering mysteries of these wartime sinkings serve as both a caution and a reminder. Even in a conflict defined by industrial-scale documentation, some events resisted explanation. Some silences remained unbroken. And some ships, whether lost to enemy weapons, structural weakness, or ill-timed coincidence, left questions that the record alone cannot fully answer. As we look back on the war's most puzzling disappearances, we are reminded of an uncomfortable truth. In the vastness of the world's oceans, certainty is often the first casualty. The final casualty is the truth we never fully recover.